Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. The Responsible Edge is a show about marketing practice that not only achieve results, but do so with integrity. So today I was delighted to be joined by Joanna Auburn, co-founder of the platform Trace. Trace provides services to help businesses achieve net zero emissions through a dashboard platform that helps measure emissions, set reduction targets, and engage employees in sustainability efforts. So really, really interesting kind of background that Joe's had, coming from not necessarily the sort of background that you would expect to end up leading a company like Trace. But we had a brilliant conversation that really focused initially on the role of supply chain transparency, or the growing trend towards supply chain transparency and sustainability, and some of the sort of implications and influences on that from both a regulatory perspective, but equally from an employee engagement point of view and broader stakeholder engagement perspective too. We then talked a little bit about the value that Jo sees in the work that she's doing in transparency and being more transparent, certainly in terms of the way that the supply chain affects scope 3 emissions, etc., from a branding and marketing point of view. So that was a particularly interesting part of it. And then really interestingly, we got into some of the detail around the reporting element and the starting point for any organization that's looking to engage on their sustainability or in their sustainability journey. So really interesting conversation. Again, as with everybody that we've had on so far, we had also a fantastic piece of kind of personal advice that she offers to junior marketeers out there at the end of the conversation. So just want to say a big thank you to Jo. One final thing just to note, again, as always, is that if you've got any thoughts or questions, comments, be really keen to get your feedback on what you think of the show, what you think of my terrible hosting skills, and what you think of essentially the episodes that we put together. So yeah, thank you again for listening, and yeah, hope you enjoyed the show. Jo, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I should have probably actually mentioned that during our initial catch up before, but yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show and be, I think, our 12th guest. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
And just really keen to kind of kick things off by asking a little bit more about you, your background, and explaining a little bit about the work that you're doing at Trace. Feel free to go back as far as you like. If you want to go back to school days, if there's anything interesting from there, feel free to do so. But just, yeah, give us a flavor of you and what you've done so far in your career.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for having me. It's amazing to be here. I won't go back to school. I won't bore you with that, but I will probably go back to where I started my background, I guess, began in engineering, sustainable civil engineering, actually, which is quite an unusual start to a career, I think. And I moved into the renewable energy space in the UK, joining one of the first retail renewable energy suppliers that existed in the UK to shake up the market in their product function. And that, I think, just really started me off quite flukily in the right direction for me. So I've worked primarily in scaling tech businesses in the product function for my whole career, and then left that more recently in the last 5 years to start my own business. My co-founder and I had previously started a business whilst in our I guess proper jobs might be the wrong way to phrase it, but whilst in our day-to-day jobs, and we were building a fashion brand and really tried to build it sustainably, but really struggled with the tools and resources to do that effectively and at the budgets that we had, which was a great inspiration for Trace and how we're solving for businesses today.
Jo, that was one of the most succinct and wonderful nutshells and introductions I think we've had so far on our show. That was absolutely brilliant. I think you probably, considering how concise you were, you probably could have gone back to the school days and given us some of the things that went on there.
I didn't rehearse it. I didn't even know how to react to that.
It was very polished. It was very polished. Let me ask you, I want to ask you about what we're looking at that. you mentioned the fashion brand and some of the issues that can you go into a bit more detail and depth about some of those issues that you faced relating to how do you build a sustainable fashion brand and some of the issues that led to the development of Trace?
Gosh, yeah, you're taking me back. Well, I think with a consumer-facing brand, which is what it was, as you guys will know, very relevant to the anti-greenwashing charter, how you brand yourselves can have great influence over how much you sell. But you want to be true and authentic in how you do that. And there are a lot of sustainable fashion brands out there. And what they're actually doing is then far ranging, I guess, in how actually sustainable they are, or whether they're sort of virtue signaling by planting a tree for every sort of bad product that you make on the world. My view is that that's not quite good enough. We had no choice but to build our product out of country, which was Australia at that time, where we were located, which bringing anything into Australia has high emission. So we really struggled with just basic transport, how we were going to actually solve that from a logistical and product point of view. And then we struggled with how do we actually market this, because we felt it wasn't quite right to say it was fully sustainable if it was being flown around the world before you bought it. So that I think just how conflicted you feel about all of those things. And that's actually where transparently measuring and showing that you're aiming to reduce do actually really help you feel authentic in how you communicate your intentions. Because I think a lot of, I guess, to talk to greenwashing, a lot of it doesn't come from a bad place. There are a few bad players out there that have done a disservice to most, but most people have good intentions, and they don't mean to mislead the market, but maybe a lack of knowledge or lack of full transparency of what's going on in their head because they're not sure how to communicate it means it ends up leading to a greenwashing scenario. And we just really struggled with that whole complexity. Like, how do we actually measure? What do we actually need to do for our brand? What should we do? How do we communicate it? And that actually led to us building this software platform and going through kind of a venture background or process for that.
Very super interesting. That whole notion of essentially we were confused essentially as how we approached this and wanted to have some sort of tool, some sort of platform, some sort of framework in order to learn, discover, and improve and set the agenda and set the vision for the business. Leading on very nicely, and obviously we're going to come back and talk a bit more about Trace, sort of the back end of today's conversation. But can you just briefly, we've kind of begun to introduce what Trace actually does, but can you just briefly explain what Trace does and how it resolves those issues that you face with the fashion brand that you developed?
Yes. So Trace is a combination of technology and services to help SMEs decarbonize, essentially. So that starts with measuring your footprint, understanding where you're at today. And then we really focus in on how you can reduce that, what your strategy might be, and how you can activate and engage your workforce to make that actually happen. We've got reporting kind of ready for regulation, all of those things that you might need. But the key things I think that we do that help us stand out are helping you activate your workforce. So this isn't a tick box exercise. It's something that actually moves internally. And lastly, storytelling. So helping you talk about the journey that you're on without fear of greenwashing.
That's super interesting. When you think back to your experience with the fashion brand and did you have a workforce at that point? Did you have a team, or was it okay? It was small, but you knew that this was something that developing the business, that activating the workforce, getting them on side, getting them as sort of evangelists for your sustainability agenda, if you like, of a company, was going to be critical. Is that how you viewed it when thinking about Trace?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the size of workforce that Trace caters for best are ones where you've got sort of 50 staff. You need them to engage on this journey. Every single team is subject to climate risk and should be part of that process. This shouldn't just be a boardroom. Have we done some reporting? Tick. Okay, next topic. finance should be involved, procurement are involved. 70% plus of your emissions are in what you procure. So every single person that signs up to a tool should know what your climate strategy is, because they can then pick that tool in alignment to your strategy.
And presumably then you mentioned storytelling. Is there a degree of kind of the internal comms piece being crucial with that? It's not just the external facing narrative, it's how we disseminate the information internally as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And really the same message should be in both channels. They are your advocates, so you want them to go out and talk about you as they've been communicated to. So yeah, we help with both of those things, external and internal communication.
Fascinating. Well, I'm tempted to just go fully into trace, but we do begin each of our topic conversations looking at something a little bit kind of third party. But before we jump into kind of the article that we're going to be talking about today, can you just explain a little bit about like what responsible marketing ethical practice kind of means to you? You've alluded to greenwashing and the fact that Trace is sort of designed to support the mitigation of greenwashing. But what does kind of responsible and ethical marketing practice kind of mean to Joe?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I'm going to be very articulate here because I've not fully thought this through before. But
I love it when it's off the cuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's inherently in the nature and intentions of what you're doing in your business, and then being authentic, genuine, and factual about what you're doing. Whether you have a purpose business model or doesn't really matter. You just need to be, I think, transparent and truthful about how you're doing it and what you're doing. And some of that will be more ethically aligned or not to others. But it's just the key is transparency, I think.
Which perfectly brings us on to it's almost like we've sort of had a catch up before the show, Joe. But yeah, could you just provide our listeners with just like a brief intro summary, if you like, to the article that we've been looking at together? That would be great.
Yeah. So I guess the topic is supply chain transparency, whether that be environmental, social, or governance-led transparency. The area that I can really talk to is the E of ESG, which is the environment section. Not that the other sections aren't equally as important. I think the social aspects are incredibly important and probably have a longer standing place in the corporate world. Modern slavery acts, etc., have been around for much longer than a lot of the environmental acts that has gained a lot of pace in the last while. And I think my view is that radical transparency, can really accelerate the pace of change. And we've seen that happen in climate. And I think in 5 years' time, every business will have a carbon footprint. And that wouldn't have happened without regulation at the top, which has led to supply chain transparency and driven that change to happen, which we can, I guess, dig into a bit more.
I've got absolutely, Joe. That was brilliant. That was a brilliant introduction, by the way. Let me ask you the question. When you say radical transparency, which I love as a term, I think we've got our headline already.
Just gave that up.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, my next question was going to be like, what does radical transparency mean to you?
What does radical transparency mean to me? I think a big part of that is not just displaying the information you want to display. So displaying all of the information, whether it be good, bad, improving, or actually not improving over time. That I think marketers are often good at showing the information they want to show and not necessarily showing all of the information, because we can choose to disclose what we want. But actually, I think being radical about it is showing it all and being honest about it all. And that's where I guess there have been examples, haven't there, in the press where I'm not going to be able to name the exact example, but I think there was a major bank that was had to take an advertising campaign down because they had wind turbines on one of the advertising displays, which insinuated that they do a lot of investment in renewable energy, which they do, but they also invest in coal. So they had to take it down. And that was, I think, wasn't a good way to do things.
I think that might have been HSBC.
I think it might have been as well, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, by the way, we are fully okay with naming names on the responsible edge. So feel free to include them. Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. It's that we've spoken about it before. It's like people love to, you go through like a brand book, or you go through like brand values of like lots of organizations out there, and they'll talk about transparency and trust, and these being core values at the heart of what we do. And then when you actually say, well, what that means, guys, is that no organization is perfect. So essentially what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to be open and honest about the warts and all, if you like, the problems that you're facing, the issues that you're looking to address. And that's when you really get down to the authenticity of the organizations that are fully committed to that way of working, versus those that thought that those terms might be nice values to include within a brand statement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Agreed. It's fascinating. Well, radical transparency, I think, is a brilliant term. We're gonna coin that. It's a brilliant one. Talking a little bit more though about like supply chain transparency, Joe, and kind of your take on that. Obviously, with the work that you're doing at Trace, you're obviously working with lots of companies who are, as you've alluded to when you've introduced what the company's about, looking at being more transparent, being more open about where they sit from the E perspective, if you like. What implications, if any, do you think that has on supply chain kind of success, if you like, for organizations?
Yeah, I guess the angle that I'm coming at it from is there's now regulation. So large organizations have to report on their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And just so that we're all understanding the same thing, scope 3 is your supply chain, effectively. With scope 1 being the gas you might burn on site, etc. Scope 2 is your electricity. Scope 3 is everything else. So it's basically, if you report on that, you're being transparent about what you buy, sell, and how you run your business, which actually helps you understand the opportunities and risks that are important in a climate-constrained world. But it also brings about a big point of trust, because you're then reporting on someone else's emissions effectively in your scope 3, which is it's really interesting. And there are many schools of thought, and there are a lot of people working on this issue. And then it means there's a lot of double count in the market, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the level of control and influence that you have on that scope 3 is also in question. You do have some control, because you can decide who you work with in your supply chain. And that's where transparency of scope 3, which is climate reporting, leads to better business choices. Because if you know a company is or isn't doing the right thing by the climate, you can choose whether to continue that contract or continue to work with them. So things like B Corp really exaggerate that and allow you to really see and understand what a business is doing. We've just become a B Corp, just got our certification there, and you have to submit your emissions as well. So and a lot of B Corps want to work with B Corps for that reason, and might pick the marketing agency they work with from a B Corp list, rather than just going and looking on the internet or getting a recommendation, because they know how that business does business and are happy with that way of working because they've achieved a B Corp status. So I think that's where the transparency is great for the world. And from, I guess, to the point I made earlier about the acceleration of that and pace of change, that transparency accelerates that pace of change. It's actually large companies that are regulated to report on that scope 3 at the moment. A small to medium business is not regulated to do that. They don't need to do that by law, but they're caught by implication rather than legislation, because they are in the supply chain of these larger organizations and therefore have to provide that data upwards. If they've not been asked yet, I guarantee you will be in the next 2 to 3 years, 1 to 2 years probably, which then drives that change. And now we have, many SMEs measuring and reporting on their emissions who wouldn't have before because they've been asked to by a contract or tender that they need to produce. So that regulation at the top for those large companies has meant a lot of smaller businesses are now doing reporting at that level and at that quality because of the regulation that doesn't actually apply to them, but it's filtered down and proliferated through to them, which means we've got a huge amount more emission coverage across the UK than we did 5 years ago, and that pace of change is continuing. And you can see that pace of change through things like some of the regulatory formats like or frameworks like SBTI, science-based targets. They've had 9 times the amount of targets been set in the SME community, I think, in the last few years, which is amazing. I guess outside of climate reporting, transparency just shines a light on how you do your business and how you run your business. So it can't be a bad thing for people to be able to see that if you're not shy.
But that was super interesting. We had a show previously where we talked about like vulnerability in a corporate context and how, like, you know, I think it was Brené Brown was the lady who kind of coined or certainly looked at that in terms of personal development and looking at that and how actually like it's quite applicable when you think about, you know, much of what the kind of modern corporate environment is looking for is that actually being comfortable, being vulnerable, if you like, in terms of presenting the warts and all and preparing yourself for, as you say, these regulatory changes that might not be applicable or relevant directly to you now, but this change is coming and you need to prepare yourself essentially. Let me ask you, I want to sort of slightly, I've got questions now that I want to sort of tie into your work at Trace that relate to exactly the response that you've just provided, but I just want to swim slightly back upstreams first. I think the piece of research that was referenced in the article that we looked at, which by the way, listeners will be able to share that link with you in the materials from this show, so don't worry, you'll be able to check that out. But I think the piece of research was headlined like walking the walk or talking the talk, relating to, you know, it's one thing everybody talking about transparency and supply chain transparency. It's a whole nother thing if it's ultimately going to cost you more to essentially either substantiate the sort of the nature of your supply chain for confidence around regulation, etc., or alternatively for you to, as an organization, think about ways of improving your transparency around your sustainability credentials, etc., in order to be attractive within the supply chain. What's your take on that in terms of, in your real world experience, are people prepared to pay more for, you know, for a sustainable solution?
Oof, good question. I think whether you're prepared to or whether your business requires you to can be different things. And particularly for larger businesses, because of some of this regulation, they now have targets on their heads, so they're required to. And we are hearing more of performance structures where senior staff members are actually, like, their performance metrics are around sustainability and can be around carbon. And so that then leads to the right decisions being made, or right, in my opinion, decisions being made. But whether, I think it's very different for a small business that might be struggling economically, and if they're not yet losing tenders or losing work because of this requirement, and it's extra money to spend that they see they need in their business right now as cash flow, then I can totally appreciate that that's a very difficult decision to make, and maybe not something you would make urgently. So we have to make this affordable and easily accessible to all those businesses for when they're ready to do it. And I guess it's coming down that supply chain right now.
So would you say that there's like that kind of regulatory pressure, if you like, that top-down effect, like that is the ultimate driver of this, that essentially that it's not beyond that in terms of the impact of kind of customer preference essentially on engaging with companies that are truly sustainable, that can be, that's not a key driver as the regulatory pressure.
I think there are a few key drivers. I think regulatory pressure comes to many, and that is moving at pace, and there are more and more businesses being subject to that. We can talk about a specific example later. The other drivers, though, which you might initially think are less financial, but they do actually track right back to a line item in your P&L, would be employee pressure. That's a big one. Employees demanding more of a climate or sustainability strategy internally, and if they don't get it, they'll leave. And more and more individuals are asking for this in the hiring processes. And if you can't substantiate or answer that question, and this is a competitive world for hiring good talent, you're not going to win. So that's a really big one. And then I think with the release of a lot of the sort of advertising guidelines and marketing guidelines and regulation, how you brand and market yourselves, if you're wanting to talk about yourselves in a certain way, you need to have something to substantiate it now. Otherwise, you really are actually up against the law. And I think another proof point of it, is the proliferation of B Corp. So many really small businesses are B Corps now, and they've chosen to do that. That's complete choice. Maybe because of some of those things we've just said around whether it be regulation, brand, customers, or employees, but there's a whole number of reasons. I guess investment as well is another reason or driver. Some investment firms might require you to have some level of transparency or strategy around ESG. So, I think a few different reasons, but regulation can often be the hardest to start with.
The cascading effect, I think, as you kind of alluded to.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let me ask you, Jo. So I think I'm sort of tantalized by hearing more about the kind of real examples, if you like, of organizations that you've been working with at Trace, specifically looking at kind of the issue around supply chain transparency. Can you just talk us through how that is affecting Trace customers and how, or is it a key issue for Trace customers? What are the kind of key case studies, examples that you've got of organizations that have worked with you that have seen kind of improvements and developments in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, we often hear about this because a company will come and knock on our door and say, I've got this contract with big company X, and they've asked me to provide this reporting by April, and we've never done it before. Can you guys help us? Okay. And that's where we can help you set the groundwork baseline for that reporting, and kick that off internally to be a bit of a cultural shift. To give more specific examples, an agency that works within the ITV brand's supply chain. They've been asked for this reporting to be compliant to a certain level. Another one would be that the deadline is fast approaching, is anything within the government or the NHS's supply chain has to produce a decarbonisation report now by April. So that's over 100,000 businesses in the UK that have that deadline just popped on their desk, and they don't know how to do it. So that's the kind of thing that we're hearing and seeing a lot of.
And out of interest, coming back to the way that you kind of introduced Trace before, is that almost the kind of the Trojan horse, if you like, the entry point that most people come to go, Jo, Christ, we've got this requirement, we don't know what we're doing, and then you almost start with the reporting element before moving on to employee engagement and storytelling as the kind of sort of development of the work you do?
It can be. We get a lot of it from that angle, but we do get companies coming to us who can sort of see this stuff happening, and they know their staff really care. That's the other big one. and they want to be doing something to respond to that. Most companies of a certain size have like a self-formed green team or a self-formed green group, things like that, and champions internally. And many companies will have had those for decades. The ones that have championed the recyclable cups and, you know, paper and all of that sort of thing, they now have hard and might be given budgets, and they have hard requirements that they're wanting to try and champion through the business, as knowledge has kind of been democratized, I guess, in how to get to net zero. And they're the champions that often as well are more and more senior within businesses.
And out of interest, is that the typical profile of kind of who you guys are engaging with? Is it the sort of the heads of sustainability, the sustainability directors, etc.?
If they have them, yes. Many businesses don't have them. Okay. So we brand ourselves as your like virtual sustainability team. So often this task is given to someone who already has a full-time job in the business as an extra sort of thing for them to solve. They might be head of strategy, they might be head of finance, they might be head of marketing, head of people. The role range is huge because this kind of stretches from engaging your staff and cultural shift right through to regulatory and compliance level reporting. And a huge impact on finance.
Jo, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just got excited. It must be fascinating for you in terms of like engaging with a new organization, understanding who is it within the organization that has taken on that sustainability role with a view that that's how the organization views sustainability.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And how we then talk about our value proposition, we can emphasize different parts of it from a sales kind of point of view. Yes. To make sure we're talking to their need.
And out of interest, because obviously we're interested in, I guess, well, we're interested in all of it, but specifically the marketing sort of side of things. What are the kind of nuances, if you like? What are really recognizable characteristics of the kind of SME clients that you're working with, whereby, you know, the head of marketing, director of marketing has taken on the sustainability area? Like, what are the kind of pain points, discussion points, etc., that they kind of come to you with?
I think there's a huge knowledge gap, and there are a lot of we refer to it as like the acronym soup. There's just so many acronyms that is floating around out there, and no one's got a clue what they all mean. And a lot of these reporting and standards have been created, but you can't go down to the canteen and ask someone how they did their report because no one's done them yet. So everybody's learning on the go. And then there's also this fear of greenwashing. So no one wants to talk publicly about the challenge they're having. So we've ended up with this new term called green hushing. So, and you've just got this real, I guess, anxiety. Those people have been given a whole new topic that's a profession in itself to solve internally. So they're anxious, they want support through the process. Many of the calls end up being slightly counselling, to be honest. It's okay, don't worry, we've got you back. Like, because there's just such a fear and pressure to deliver on something that they feel that there's a real knowledge gap with.
That's fascinating. I want to pick you up on the green hushing, because again, we're hearing like more and more that it's becoming such a common theme. We were speaking to a fairly large media company actually a couple of weeks ago who was telling us that they've like done a piece of research looking with their clients at the number of kind of sustainability focused campaigns that the clients are running. And over the last couple of years, there's been like a massive dive in the number of campaigns across the board that the clients are including. They're one of the world's leading media companies. So that is testament to the fact that people are, excuse the language, scared shitless to get this stuff wrong. Out of interest, when you've got like I'm marketing director of a company, I come and I speak to you, Jo, I have my brilliant counseling session where you tell me that everything's going to be okay and that don't worry, we've got your back. What is it? Is it almost from their perspective, like, look, we want to work with Trace to have a reputable third party that we can start doing the kind of the scientific analysis, the tracing, if you like, of our impact, with a view that then creates clarity around the story that we're able to tell. Is that the kind of the focus from a marketing perspective in terms of how they work with you?
Yeah, and then once we've got to the outcome of a measured footprint, and which can then inform decarbonisation as a strategy, how you then communicate that. We've often, say, as an example, been given a press release to review, and the wording or language used can sometimes be a little bit clunky, or say an example, I guess that's common, I hear a lot, is like, oh, we're already net zero. Nobody's net zero. So you're not. You've got a goal to be net zero, which is a future state of your business that you are not yet. And that nuance in the language is important to get right. And they're the things that I think we can just really help with, because we can go, that's not quite how to phrase it. Let's phrase it like this. And then you're not in fear of being pointed out or circled by the press for misclaiming what you're doing. And it's very natural for people to get that a little bit wrong, because it is all new language. It's a whole new dictionary to get your head around. And that's what we're there for.
Yeah, really interesting. So is that, when you spoke about Trace at the beginning, you mentioned that it's a mixture of kind of tools and consultancy. Is that the kind of consultancy part of it, that you guys will kind of provide that kind of communication, branding kind of piece?
Yeah, we're able to help with those sorts of things. Other kind of, I guess, support or consulting services might be more around your strategy internally, workshopping that with your teams, and just ensuring you get to the outcome that you need for your business, which might be to submit a tender that requires a certain level of reporting, or to have science-based targets, and then to be held accountable with, meetings with us at varying increments. So yeah, combination of product to make it nice and efficient, and something that you can access continuously, and self-serve from, plus support and expertise to help you on the journey, because you don't just want to be given a login for net zero. It's too big a beast.
Too big a beast indeed. Out of interest, when it comes to the employee engagement side of things, is there a kind of a Trace kind of platform for employees, or is that more in the kind of workshop-y consultancy side of things?
Yeah, we do have tools and a platform where employees can measure their carbon footprint, and we have campaigns where you can then sort of aggregate that data and understand the behaviours at an aggregate level of your staff. And most of it's around making it fun, so making it so that it starts the conversation rather than talking about regulation or whatever, which often gets a few glazed eyeballs. Everybody gets a climate persona. It's something fun. You can talk about which one you are and share with others. And we've had the CEO of Deloitte in Australia share their persona on their town hall, for example, which then makes everyone go, oh, I want to go find out my persona. So that those kind of fun and gamification aspects of it do go down well.
Yeah, fascinating. Very. It sounds. I have to admit, I think we've Trace has got such a so intriguing in terms of the packaging up of the elements that you've described, and it's been great to kind of go through and plug, I guess, some of the kind of key aspects of it, which I'm sure listeners will be interested in finding out more about. Let me just sort of finish on this kind of section of things, Joe, and just ask you kind of, again, sort of slightly stepping away from Trace, but obviously considering your experience of the clients that you're working with, like looking ahead, to the future. You've mentioned that kind of regulatory pressure is obviously the key driver at the moment for a lot of the change that's occurring, certainly when it comes to supply chain and supply chain's transparency around sustainability. Like, what do you see the future holding in terms of the impact of perhaps consumer demand or any other form of regulation? Like, what's your, if I was to get your crystal ball take on where you think this is going, perhaps if we focus here in the UK in this response, where do you see things heading in the next sort of 5 to 10 years?
I think easily in the next 5 years, every business will have a carbon footprint or a climate strategy associated to that, just like they have a financial strategy and a P&L and a tax return. And I think that will be a requirement for every business to submit one on an annual basis. Progressing and engaging with that internally is something that I think will happen over time. I guess the government's goal is to get the whole of the UK covered in terms of carbon managed, so that they can know where it is, what it is, where it's being driven, so they can target those areas with the right funding frameworks and regulation to ensure that policy moves that forward. But I think we all have a role and responsibility to move it forward ourselves, with or without government. So yeah, I just think the reporting aspect will be commonplace. The language that we're talking about now that seems new will be commonplace, and much of it will be completely automated.
Brilliantly succinct and clear. Here's a question for you, just to as I say, get your take on this as well. If you're an organization you're listening to this, you're one of those people that you've just alluded to, you're working within an SME and you've been tasked with sustainability as a bolt on to your otherwise kind of, fairly lengthy job description. And you're umming and ahhing about like, oh, do I have to engage in this? Like, it's just a can of worms, etc. Like, what's your justification to them? Like, what's the bit of advice that you would give them in terms of how to go about, beginning to approach this journey of sustainability?
Oof. I think there is a real element of which I often apply to myself, actually. Don't look up. Just do the first thing first, and then we'll help. It's take baby steps. Start with measuring, and then that will be an eye-opening exercise that will allow you to kind of see visually the analytics on the dashboard that help you break that problem down. Whereas if you just look at it as this big thing, it's just so overwhelming. So I think take small bits, make progress incrementally, and don't let perfection be the enemy, because that is, I think, one of the major problems that we have with net zero is that, and green hushing, as we described before, people are striving for perfection, and we are where we are because we're not perfect, which is why we need to report and manage the emissions as soon as possible.
And would you pitch that actually there's almost like a branding opportunity, I guess, for those organizations to say, do you know what, if we can get ahead of ahead of the competition here, perhaps, and we can begin this process and we can begin to be really clear and open and transparent about where we are, that actually there's potentially a competitive advantage in being viewed in a more positive way amongst all of our stakeholders, employees, customers, etc., etc. Would that be look, you can begin this process and you can have something that's truly valuable to your brand right now in place by simply starting?
Absolutely. I think it can be a massive competitive advantage if you're in an industry that just by nature of it hasn't been particularly sustainable, or it's not particularly impact focused. There's a real opportunity to lead by example. Start with yourselves, and then there might even be commercial opportunities to sell services related to it. Say marketing is a good example. You can then focus on helping people craft their green messaging through their brand that is accurate, especially if you've done it for yourself first. And there's a lot of those opportunities in the financial sector as well, because a lot of the inputs to climate reporting is finance. So I think leading by example, there's commercial opportunities, and there's certainly monetary gain in low churn of staff and hiring great staff without having to go and search really, really hard for them, because you'll attract them much easier if you have a great strategy and branding of that strategy.
And out of interest, Jo, you've already mentioned finance and marketing, but are there any other sectors that you kind of have from a Trace perspective, you're thinking that's a sector that the early adopters, the first movers are going to see a real, potentially a really positive impact if they begin to look at this stuff?
I think it depends from what lens you're looking at it from. If you're looking at it from a lens of being able to commercialize that knowledge and I guess, take hold of the opportunity from a business opportunity. I think they're the big ones.
Mm-hmm.
But there's certainly sectors that there is, I think, even greater opportunity for them to have an impact emissions wise, like logistics, anything energy focused, where you're physically moving or creating goods. There are huge opportunities there. Construction, real estate, like the built environment is a huge focus of the UK government, and they've actually done really quite well at rolling out a lot of the systems and processes to help our residential kind of world become more sustainable. A lot more to do, but yeah, I think there's great opportunity in all of those areas, depending on what lens you're looking at it from.
Really interesting. Joe, I'm jumping around here, so apologies for this, but it's triggered when you were speaking about taking that first step and on the reporting journey, just to kind of appease again any kind of, I'm kind of getting my head into the trying to get my mind into the head. You know what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to think from the perspective of a head of marketing who's been tasked with looking at sustainability. And they're thinking, okay, that all sounds great, but what does the reporting phase actually involve in a practical sense? Am I going to be sitting there having to, share or do lots of analysis myself, or does Trace kind of nurture me and help me through that process? Like, what does that reporting element actually look like in a practical sense?
Yeah, good question. That reporting element can be incredibly easy for the first stage of your reporting, and there's ways for us to make it more granular and improve its accuracy over time, which is what I always recommend if you're starting the journey. A large input to it is your financial data, which every business has to have, and Trace's systems and processes and team are there to make that super simple for you. We've spent a lot of time building a product that makes the input of that information really slick. And then teams to help you with what information, when, how to put that in. But it really isn't as complex as it sounds. It's actually really quite easy. We have companies do it in an hour, and then we have other companies that take a bit longer just because by virtue of the complexity of the business. But it's really not as hard as it sounds. It's just breaking it down.
That is great. I'm sure there are, hopefully some relieved marketing directors out there who are thinking to themselves, okay, it sounds like I can manage this. An hour is something I can commit to at least begin the process. Joe, that was really, really interesting. I know we've had a whistle-stop tour of supply chain transparency, etc., and obviously talking about Trace. We always like to finish the conversation though with kind of asking you to think back to kind of the early stages of your career and thinking about the time when you were in civil engineering, etc. What would be the number one kind of piece of advice you'd offer to your younger self in terms of embarking on your professional career? It can be anything related to how they manage themselves, how they approach their work, priorities. What would you offer in terms of advice?
I actually think one of the best pieces of advice that my co-founder and I were given early on was don't look up. I mean, I said it earlier in the podcast. I think sometimes the journey ahead of you, and I feel this particularly as a founder, when you've taken investment, you've got huge goals, they can feel incredibly overwhelming. And sometimes you just got to look at the week ahead. That doesn't mean we don't plan for the future and have a vision, but you can't do that day to day, zoom in and out. That's incredibly time consuming. Like the cognitive load of that is really hard. So yeah, don't look up, baby steps, and don't let perfection be the enemy of progress.
Well, there we go. We literally have our intro bio for this episode. That was brilliant. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you so much. That's kind of been 45 minutes or so. So thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully, if you haven't been totally put off by it, we might be able to invite you back on to dive into another area related to kind of sustainability or ethical practice. So yeah,
Pleasure.
thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.